Prayer, Jehovah, hear to my entreating cry. In faithfulness give ear, in righteousness reply. No God have I but thee. Teach me to do thy will. Thy Spirit's
like we will. I know we do need a bell to start. I told Melissa I get, ready to go when I'm up here and ready for the clock to strike 7 because, we've always got a lot more material to cover than we have time. But we'll go ahead and get started tonight with a word of prayer. Our God and our Father, Lord, we're thankful to you for this night. We're thankful to you for the beautiful weather that you've blessed us with. We're thankful to you, Lord, for Solomon and for all that we can learn from him. We're thankful to you, Lord, that you told David that you would be to him a father and that he would be to you a son. We're thankful to you, Father, that through Christ we can be adopted as your sons and daughters as well, and that we can be brothers and sisters with one another. We pray, dear Father, that you'll help us to pursue after the wisdom that you have so graciously promised to give to all those who ask. And we pray all these things in your Son's most holy name. Praise Jesus. Amen. All right, so we're going to be in this our second lesson of 1 Kings. And there are books in the back. The books are really good. And so if you don't already have a copy, I would encourage you to get one. I won't promise you that I'm going to follow the book in any kind of structured way, but the book is really good, and what the book will encourage you to do is to read, and that's the one thing that I would, ask you to do to prepare for class, is wherever we stop, just keep reading in 1 Kings, because, it's just so simple and easy. The way that we grow in knowledge concerning the Bible is just by spending time with the Bible, and reading is the easiest way for us to do that. You don't have to think about, how to study or what to study or, do I need a devotional, and you've got reading plans that are provided for you here, but it all comes back to just reading the Bible. And you'll remember from last Wednesday night, last week, that we finished up 2 Samuel with Josh, and we're starting 1 Kings in this quarter. And when we ended up last Wednesday night, we saw David as an old man. He is bedridden. He can't keep warm. And so the one solution that they found for him was to find a beautiful young woman who would lie in bed with him to keep him warm. And we're told that he did not have sex with her. And there's probably two reasons that we're told that. The second reason is going to come up tonight. The first is it's probably an indication of how physically decayed and decreased and how old David has become. And we're going to look at the second reason tonight. And then the very last scene that we looked at is in 1 Kings chapter 1 and about verse 16, where Adonijah is exalting himself, saying that he'll be king. He's conspiring with Joab and Abiathar. He's leaving out Benaiah, Zadok, Solomon, and Nathan. And Nathan goes to Bathsheba and says, "Do you see what's happening?" And tells her, "You need to listen to me if you want to live and if you want to make sure that Solomon lives." And so together they hatch a plan, which is where we pick up tonight in verse 17. So in verse 17, Bathsheba steps into David's chamber. Abishag is there tending to David. She pays homage to the king, and he says, "What do you want?" Or other translations say he asks her, "What do you desire?" And what she says in verse 17 is, "My Lord, you swore to your servant by the Lord your God, your son Solomon is to become king after me, and he is the one who is to sit on my throne." And then she goes on to tell him about what Adonijah is doing. And then Nathan, as soon as Bathsheba is done, comes in and basically says the same thing. They tell him, "Are you aware that Adonijah is doing this? Are you aware of those that are with him? Are you aware that he is not including Solomon, Zadok, Nathan, and Benaiah, is all of this happening because this is what you want? And the question all comes back to verse 17. Did you not say this? Did you not say, David, that you wanted Solomon to be king? What's going on with Adonijah? That's the question. Now, the question for us tonight is, when did David say what Bathsheba quotes? When did he say that Solomon would be king? That's right. We don't know. She says it to him, and then in a moment he's going to repeat it back to her. So they're both stating this as if this is something that has happened, but this is the first time, as we read from 2 Samuel into 1 Kings, that we're finding out about it, is when Bathsheba confronts David about what Adonijah is up to, and when she and Nathan are working together to make sure that Solomon becomes king. Now, in 1 Chronicles, we get maybe a more complete picture about everything that is going on, because the last 7 chapters of 1 Chronicles, a lot of text and material are devoted to David preparing Solomon to build the temple. And the other thing that we looked at last week is that when Solomon is born, God tells Nathan to call Solomon Jedediah. The text seems to indicate that Solomon is the name that Bathsheba gave him, but then Nathan arrives after he's born and gives him another name from God, which is Jedediah, which means beloved of the Lord, which is our first indication that Solomon is the one that God had promised David would succeed him and would be the one to build God's house. All right. Questions or comments before we move on from here? Kathy?
In verse 13, when he says, go at once to David and say, have you not, my lord or king, sworn to your maidservant, saying, da 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 da. Could it have been just like a conspiracy thing?
Yeah, it could have been, and there are those who think that's what's going on, that Nathan and Bathsheba are working together and that they're basically tricking David, that David never said it. I don't think that's what's happening, because the one other example we have of that is when Jacob deceives Isaac, and we're told exactly what's going on there. And so my thought, I would find it hard to believe that that's what's happening here, and for it not to be spelled out to us that that's what's going on. But yeah, it is possible, because we don't know. We don't know when David said this. We've got Nathan saying David said it, Bathsheba saying to David that he said it, and then David in a moment repeating back to Bathsheba and saying that that's what he said and that's what he's going to do.
Because he says, I'll go in and confirm it right after you say it.
Mm-hmm.
So not only David and Bathsheba had talked about it, but Nathan knew about it. If that's the correct.
Right. Andy.
Adonijah knew it too, because he invited all the other sons, but not Solomon. And he didn't invite the other ones that probably would have been as part of the regular coronation.
Yeah. And also to your point, later on, now it's not like a sure thing, but later on Adonijah is going to say that it was from the Lord that Solomon be king. But, you don't know at what point in time did he realize that. But there's a lot about what Adonijah does that paints the picture that he kind of knows that he's not the one, that he's just kind of trying to take advantage of the state that David's in and kind of slide his way into succeeding his father. All right. Now, next up, David acts and Solomon's made king. So after Bathsheba comes in to David and says, "Did you not say this?" Then she leaves and Nathan comes in and confirms everything that Bathsheba has just told David about what Adonijah is up to. Then the very next thing that David does is he calls for Bathsheba back. He wants Bathsheba to come back in. When she comes back in verses 29 and 30, he says, "The king swore an oath and said, 'As the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life from every difficulty, just as I swore to you by the Lord God of Israel, your son Solomon is to become king after me, and he is the one who is to sit on my throne in my place. That is exactly what I will do this very day.'" And then he calls in the three who were not invited, who were David's officials. He calls Nathan, Zadok, and Benaiah, and he gives them instructions about what they're to do. And what they're to do is they're to take Solomon and they're to put Solomon on David's mule. Clay told me that I had to refer to this as Mule Force 1. And so that's what's going on here. It's the royal mount. And what David is doing here is anyone who sees Solomon on his mule is going to know that that's David's mule. They would have recognized it, the people in Jerusalem. And when they see Solomon on David's mule, what that's automatically communicating to everyone who sees it is that the only way this is happening is if David wants it to happen. This is happening because David has instructed for it to be so. So they're to put Solomon on the royal mule. They're to take him outside the city to Gihon, a spring right outside the city. They're to anoint him, blow the trumpet, and proclaim, "Long live King Solomon," and then put him back on the mule and bring him back into the palace and sit him on David's throne. Now, when this happens, when they blow the trumpet and they shout, "Long live King Solomon," we get this really incredible scene of basically this flash mob breaking out in Jerusalem, to where everyone's shouting and everyone's celebrating, and they're all yelling, "Long live King Solomon," as Solomon makes his way from outside the city back in and takes his place on David's throne. And the scene is very, very similar to Jesus' triumphal entry. You'll remember the instruction that Jesus gave his disciples for how they were to find the colt that he was to ride on. So with David, we've got David giving instructions and basically in the moment deciding to do this and saying, "This is what I want done." And then it happens and this celebration breaks out. Jesus gives his disciples instructions for how to find the colt. They follow the instructions. Jesus rides into the city on the colt, and we have this spontaneous celebration break out as Jesus makes his entry into the city. It's really, really similar to what's going on with Solomon here. All right, and then next up, Adonijah. So we're back to Adonijah, and you remember that the last time we left Adonijah, he was having this feast. And Adonijah's feast is ending right as Solomon is being anointed king. And so his feast is coming to an end, the party is over, and as they're all kind of getting up and getting ready to wrap things up and to go home, they hear the uproar from the city. And Joab is really the first one to kind of maybe suspect that something is going on that's not going to be good for those who are with Adonijah. Because he asks, "What does this uproar in the city mean?" And then right as they hear it, Jonathan, who is Abiathar's son, arrives. And Adonijah, you have this just this incredible dialogue going on where Adonijah says, "See, you are a worthy man. Surely you bring good news." And Jonathan just simply says, "No." And then he goes on to tell Adonijah everything that has happened and how David has instructed for Solomon to become king. And then the other thing that we see here from Jonathan in verses 47 and 48 is he tells them about what David has done. As Solomon arrives to take his place on David's throne, Jonathan tells Adonijah and everyone who is with him, then the king bowed in worship on his bed, and the king went on to say this, Blessed be the Lord God of Israel. Today he has provided one to sit on my throne, and I am a witness. The thing that we know about kind of the location of these two events, Solomon's anointing and Adonijah's feast, is that they're both happening right outside of Jerusalem. And so just imagine for a moment that the Murray County Courthouse is the palace. That's the site of David's throne. Well, it would kind of be like Adonijah's having his feast at Riverside Dam, and then Solomon is anointed at the 5th Street Bridge going into Riverside Park. They were really, really close. And so all of this is happening at the same time. They're hearing the uproar in the city. They're receiving word from Jonathan about what has happened. And we see in verses 49 and 50 how they reacted. Then all of Adonijah's guests got up trembling and went their separate ways. Adonijah was afraid of Solomon, so he got up and went to take hold of the horns of the altar. Now, remember, why did Nathan tell Bathsheba that she's got to do something? What did he tell Bathsheba she should be afraid of? Right, execution. And so it's really interesting when Adonijah finds out that, basically the gig is up. Like, this isn't going to work. I'm not going to be the next king. The first thing that he does is fear for his life. And to me, you kind of get maybe a picture of who Adonijah is and what's in his heart. Because one way of looking at this is that Nathan was absolutely right to tell Bathsheba that she should be afraid for her life and for Solomon's life. And when Adonijah realizes that he's not going to be king, he's afraid that Solomon is going to do what he would have done if he were in Solomon's position. He's afraid that he's going to be executed. So he runs and he takes hold of the horns of the altar. And then as we keep reading in 1 Kings chapter 1, verses 52 and 53, we get to see Solomon's first act as king, which is to deal with Adonijah. So he tells Adonijah he's not going to kill him. He has him brought from the altar to him. Adonijah comes and bows down before Solomon in verses 52 and 53. And Solomon said, If he will show himself a worthy man, not one of his hairs shall fall to the earth. But if wickedness is found in him, he shall die. So King Solomon sent, and they brought him down from the altar. And he came and paid homage to King Solomon. And Solomon said to him, Go to your house. So Solomon basically tells him, keep your nose clean. Stay out of trouble, and you'll be all right. But he lets him know, if you don't, I'll kill you. And we're going to get to that here in just a little bit. All right, any thoughts or questions? All right, now we get to look at 1 Kings chapter 2 and David's instructions to Solomon, which are to act like a man. Verse 2, As for me, I am going the way of all the earth. Be strong and be a man. Now in 1 Chronicles, when we read about David preparing Solomon to build the temple and to be king, twice there David says in 1 Chronicles that Solomon is young and inexperienced. And then in 1 Chronicles chapter 28 and verse 20, then David said to his son Solomon, Be strong and courageous, and do the work. Don't be afraid or discouraged, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He won't leave you or abandon you until all the work for the service of the Lord's house is finished. And so last week we kind of ask the question, we've got Nathan and Bathsheba working to make sure that Solomon is king, but where's Solomon? Why isn't Solomon acting on his own behalf? And I think the fact that they're acting for him, and then everything that David says to Solomon and about Solomon, we kind of get the picture that it is an open question as to whether or not Solomon's going to be up for the job. And sometimes I think maybe we miss that because we skip ahead. We skip over this part of the story and we get to Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, and we see all the great things that he does in building the temple. But the picture that we get in all that is written about the transition from David to Solomon is that there are, it's kind of an open question as to whether or not Solomon's going to be up to the job. In 1 Kings chapter 2, David says, be strong and be a man. And then he tells him, what that looks like. What exactly does David want Solomon to do to be a man? Well, the first thing that David tells him is to keep the charge of the Lord your God. And he says more than just that. He kind of keeps coming back to keeping the Lord's commands in different ways and all these different specific things that he wants Solomon to do to keep the law. And the reason is because if you keep the law, then God will keep his promises to me and now to you, and will never lack a man on the throne. And then the next thing that he wants him to do is he gives him 3 names. 3 persons that Solomon needs to deal with. Who are the 3 persons that David lists by name? Joab, Shimei, Barzillai. All right, and we got them out of order. Joab, Barzillai, Shimei. What event from David's life are all 3 of those names connected to? I'm sorry? Absalom. Yep. Absalom's rebellion. David talks about Joab first, and he tells Solomon, you know what he did to me. And then he goes on to talk about the 2 people other than Absalom that Joab killed in a time of peace after the war was over. But it's kind of like this is all about Absalom. He doesn't say it by name. He says, you know what he did to me. And then he talks about the 2 other people that Joab killed that he wasn't supposed to. And then he talks about Barzillai. Barzillai is the one good person in this. He's the one that he wants Solomon to take care of. And then he gets to Shimei. The other thing that you'll notice, that all 3 of them were connected to Absalom. And look at the order. If you think about all 3 of them being connected to Absalom, we've got Joab, who was responsible for Absalom's death. You've got Barzillai, who took care of David after he crossed the Jordan. And you've got Shimei, who cursed David when he was leaving Jerusalem. So, end, middle, beginning. He starts with Absalom's death, and he works backwards. And so Josh and I were talking about this after class last Wednesday night. When you think about what's the worst part of David's life, what was the low point? What was the great tragedy of David as king? I think if we were to answer that question, that most of the time, the first thing we would talk about would be Bathsheba and then Uriah. But I think part of what may be indicated to us here is that for David, the worst part was Absalom. Suffering the rebellion of a son against him, and then having given specific instructions to Joab and everyone hearing not to kill him, just to have Joab kill him. And then we see how he reacted when he finds out, where he says openly, if only it could have been me. If only I could have died in his place. And so here at the end of his life, when he's giving Solomon his final instructions, that's the event that he's going back to. And he's basically wrapping up all the family business with all those who were involved in Absalom's rebellion, who either dealt poorly with David, or in the case of Barzillai, dealt kindly with David. All right, thoughts or comments, Dick?
The man of valor didn't take care of those items himself because they were against him. They weren't sinning against Solomon. They were sinning against David, or they were going against David. So why is he leaving that to Solomon to take care of rather than he took care of himself?
Well, Shimei is the easiest one to answer because he told him that I won't kill you. But he didn't. Apparently that did not extend beyond David. And so Shimei is the easy answer. You know, he met him at the river, asked for forgiveness, and David forgave him and said, I won't kill you. But now he wants Solomon to do it. So that's why for that one. Barzillai, remember, he tried to get him to come back to Jerusalem with him so that he could reward him then. And the interesting thing about Barzillai and why I think David liked him so much is when you look at when David first became king, one of the things that becomes really obvious to us about David is David hates deceit. So you think about, you know, the people that came to him to tell him that Saul was dead and to try and claim credit for it, and he kills them. And so David hates deceit and does not like people who try to take advantage of a situation. And Barzillai doesn't do that. Says, no, go on back to Jerusalem. I'm old. I don't want to go to Jerusalem. I've got everything that I need here. And so Barzillai is just more an extension for Solomon to remember the good that he did for him, not necessarily like unfinished business. Joab's the one that, I don't know, other than it was a messed up situation between the two of them. And it seems to be before David dies, he wants to know that he's going to be that Joab will be dealt with.
David wanted to live. Killed Absalom.
Yeah.
And how brutal your enemies become the way they're killed. I mean, like Joab was going to go across the river there and chop a guy's head off. I mean, when you're an enemy, you're going to die a horrific death.
Yeah, and all three, Absalom and the two that David names here, Absalom was the one that was most directly against David because David had given specific instructions. The other two, the war was over. David was at peace with them, and Joab took it upon himself to kill them. Not necessarily in direct defiance of David's orders, but more against, the understanding that David had established that, the war is over and they're on our side now. Andy.
Barzillai, after he had helped David, David said, let me take care of you. And he said, no, take care of my son. This is him taking care of Barzillai's son. And Joab, I think, Joab just was too competent. He accomplished things for David, or that helped David. David had wanted to replace him as a commander, but when he attacked Jerusalem and he said, whoever takes the city, that he'll be the commander. Well, then Joab takes the city, and Joab becomes the commander again. It's just, David didn't like him, didn't want him, but Joab just seemed to get things done.
Yeah. That is incredibly talented, but has terrible off-the-field behavior. And, and so it's always this deal with the devil with Joab as against David. And the other thing about Joab is, the line, and to essentially make sure that he dies. And so you also have the possibility of Joab being a threat to Solomon. Ben.
There's so much irony and conflicting agendas and all sorts of things going on, and it's clear that at one point, Joab, of course, partially because he is that, very prevalent, look at me athlete, as you said. But the crazy thing about it is a lot of what Joab does is to protect David, even killing Solomon. David's like, Absalom. David's like, I wish it were me. Well, it would have been if Joab had not acted the way that he did, but he was instructed directly not to. His loyalties to David were very conflicted. He's protecting the king by killing the king's son under a direct order not to. However, if he hadn't, then the king would have died, and they've got a very messed up relationship. But parallel, that's why he did whatever he thought was right in his own eyes.
Yeah.
I think Joab was the ultimate patriot for Israel.
Yeah.
And wherever he thought the leadership should go, he was going to try to make that happen for the good of them. But letting him live was not going to be a good thing. It wasn't going to end well because he's his favorite son. He's going to let Absalom back in his circle and all that. And so I think he was just to a fault. He was a patriot for Israel.
I come to the conclusion that Joab's a rascal. I mean, he's so deceitful. The people that he hugs and then sticks the knife into, no reason for him to do either one of those. He goes against the Edomites. David ends up having to go over there because Joab can't conquer them. Joab was all show, but he would definitely stick somebody in the back. I mean, he had no problem with that whatsoever. But as much of his ability to lead the army as he did Abner, and he really wanted Abner to be his right-hand commander.
The other thing I think about Joab is like, sometimes I think about the stories we're studying about now, and I think about, like, if I could step into the story, like, where would I want to be? And so there's two places. One place is I would have liked to have grown up around Joab and his brothers at a safe distance. Mention that is, growing up, we all probably knew, a boy or a young man who just couldn't turn it off. Like, their whole way of relating to the world, one thing, which was to kill. And David draws this distinction between what we do and what's okay when we're at war, which is not okay when we're at peace. And Joab, the impression we get of him is that he doesn't have that distinction. He has what seems right in his mind, and right is usually going to involve.
It is interesting too, the way that things unfold. You wonder how much life laying with his concubines and doing all that. It's all prophetic. It's the things that are going to happen to him because of his sin that's highlighted for us. But you wonder how often David thought, this is happening because of what I did. If he contemplated that, I can't imagine he wouldn't have, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and thinking about that, like, you remember, President George W. Bush, one time, and this is well known, so hopefully you're familiar with it, but in an interview, like, all the members of the media are there, and the question was, are you concerned about how you'll be remembered in history? And his reply was, in history we'll all be dead. And that, to me, that's like David at this moment. Like, he tells Solomon, I'm about to die, and these are the last things. So there's probably not a lot of introspection about, what he's telling Solomon to do. It's just, I want you to be faithful to God. And remember in 1 Kings, when we talk about being faithful to God, it's just simply, don't worship idols. Worship God only. And then here are 3 men that I need you to deal with. And Barzillai, it's take care of his son. The other 2, it's don't let him go to the grave in peace. And then in verse 10, David dies. In verse 12, we read, Solomon sat on the throne of his father David, and his kingship was firmly established. We're going to see variations of this phrase a few times over the next chapter or so. And anytime you see this phrase, some variation of the kingdom established in Solomon's hand, I want you to remember 2 Samuel 7. You remember David wanted to build God a house, and God told Nathan, tell David, this is what I'm about to do for him. And here's some of what God said that relates to this point of the kingdom being established. He said, you're going to have a son who will sit on the throne. God says, I will establish his kingdom. I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Your house and kingdom will endure before me forever, and your throne will be established forever. And so when we get to Solomon and we're reading about his kingdom being established, think 2 Samuel 7. That's what's going on here. This is the fulfillment in Solomon of what God told Nathan to tell David that God was getting ready to do for him. All right. Now let's look at Bathsheba's final act. And it's in 1 Kings chapter 2, verses 13 through 25. We've got three people involved here. We've got Adonijah again, Bathsheba, and Solomon. And Bathsheba is kind of the main character of these verses here. And it's here that I'm going to confess to you my admiration for Bathsheba. And what I admire about Bathsheba is I admire the way God brings her from David sending for her becoming pregnant, David killing her husband, to now her son sitting on the throne. You just think about that for a moment. You know, we're talking about Ruth and Rahab type of intervention by God in the life of this woman to bring her to this point that we're reading about now, where her son Solomon is sitting on the throne. And as I think about everything that God did for her, you know, I'm of the opinion that she probably was a remarkable woman. And we may kind of see some of her wisdom and some of her intelligence and how she navigates what's happening here. So here when we read these verses, Adonijah comes to Bathsheba, and the first thing that she asks is, do you come peaceably? And he says, peaceably. And she basically says, what do you want? And he tells her, you know that all Israel thought I was going to be king. But it wasn't me, it was Solomon, and that's from the Lord. Now, I want you to speak to your son on my behalf. And what Adonijah wants is he wants Bathsheba to go to Solomon and to ask Solomon to give Abishag the Shunammite to Adonijah as his wife. And Bathsheba says, very well, I will speak to the king for you. All right? And then 1 Kings chapter 2 and verses 18 through 22, we read, she says, I will speak to you for the king. So Bathsheba went to King Solomon to speak to him on behalf of Adonijah. And the king rose to meet her and bowed down to her. Then he sat on his throne and had a seat brought for the king's mother, and she sat on his right. Then she said, I have one small request to make of you. Do not refuse me. And the king said to her, make your request, my mother, for I will not refuse you. She said, let Abishag the Shunammite be given to Adonijah your brother as his wife. King Solomon answered his mother, and why do you ask Abishag the Shunammite for Adonijah? Ask for him the kingdom also, for he is my older brother, and on his side are Abiathar the priest, and Joab the son of Zeruiah. Then King Solomon swore by the Lord, saying, God, do so to me, and more also, if this word does not cost Adonijah his life. So what do you think about Bathsheba's actions here? Tell me how you read what she's doing and what her intent is and what she might be thinking as she takes these actions. Lee.
Could be two things. She's still thinking maybe that she could get Adonijah back into being king somehow or another. But on the other part of it is when he goes to her, she says, do you come peacefully? It seems to me like she's weary of him or really scared that he's going to do something to her. Is the way I look at it.
Yep. Andy?
Yeah, I think she was afraid of, because he's in her house, and, if she doesn't agree, who knows what could happen. So I think she agrees that, all right, I'll talk to the king. I think she knows that it's not going to go well for him, I suspect, because she's been around the politics for so long, she probably knew that would be a hot button.
Mm-hmm. Dennis?
Yeah, I agree with Danny. I think she served him up because she knew he had to be eliminated because he was going to be a problem forever. And Adonijah was lying when he said no. All Israel expected him to be king. David told everybody, thousands of people, that Solomon was going to be king and God was the one to put him there. So it was no secret.
Mm-hmm. Ben?
I was just going to say, I think that you have to start with the question as what was the point in what Adonijah was doing? What was his motivation here? And I think if you work backwards from that standpoint, I do believe that Bathsheba knew exactly what would happen to him if she went and told Solomon what he was up to. And I think that she knew he was going to be dealt with, imprisoned at the very least, if not killed, probably killed.
Yeah. And talking about Adonijah's request, remember, we said that there's probably two reasons why we're told that David did not have sex with Abishag. And this is probably the second reason. And so Adonijah, to me, he's kind of operating in the gray here. Meaning that anyone who David has had as a wife or a concubine is automatically off limits. He would probably know that it's a non-starter. But, there's some doubt here as to what's Abishag's status. Because the writer goes out of his way to tell us that David did not have sex with her. And so she's kind of this, we don't really have a category for her and, what her future will be. Remember when David comes back after Absalom's rebellion, he takes all the concubines that Absalom slept with, and he basically, sets them aside on their own, provides for them, but never has sex with them ever again. And so Abishag, she's kind of in this category that you don't really know where she fits. And so Adonijah, to me, he's kind of operating in the gray here. And the way I read what he's doing is, again, Solomon, young, inexperienced, David, be strong, act like a man. And so there's a possibility here that Adonijah knows exactly what he's doing, but thinks that Solomon won't do it. Remember, Solomon told him, act right or I'll kill you. And so there's a possibility of what's going on here. Adonijah is either incredibly stupid or he is scheming here and basically gambling with his life to test Solomon. And I think that Bathsheba knows what she's doing, and I think she knows how Solomon's going to react, and essentially knows that maybe Adonijah's got it wrong when it comes to Solomon. The other thing that's really interesting here is that Bathsheba and Solomon here remind me of Mary and Jesus at the wedding feast. Remember what Mary did with Jesus? They're out of wine, and that's all she said. They're out of wine. And then she told the people who were working the wedding feast, do whatever he tells you to. And Bathsheba just goes to Solomon and says, I've got one request for you, don't refuse me. And Solomon says, whatever you want. And then she hits him with something that he never would have expected coming from her, and immediately reacts with the anger and the fire that we saw from his father, and immediately has Adonijah killed. And so now we get to meet Solomon's man. So David had Joab, Solomon has Benaiah. Then King Solomon dispatched Benaiah, son of Jehoiada, who struck down Adonijah, and he died. Just like that. Solomon gives the word, sends his man. Adonijah's dead. This is now the fourth child of David who has been killed. And we first learned about Benaiah in the stories of the mighty men. He's the one who went down into the pit and killed the lion. Difference between Benaiah and Joab. They play the same role, Joab for David and Benaiah for Solomon, but we don't have anything negative about Benaiah. Everything that we know about Benaiah is that he was in charge of the Cherethites and the Pelethites, who we think were kind of the royal guard. He wasn't included in Adonijah's rebellion. Adonijah left him out. And we don't see any of the deceit or mischievousness that we see with Joab when it comes to Benaiah. All right. Thoughts, comments, questions?
Joab recognized that Benaiah has taken his place as the executioner.
Yep. Yeah, he's going to come face to face with him in just a moment. So Bathsheba becomes the spark that lights Solomon's fire. David gives Solomon the instructions, and then Bathsheba kind of lights the fire. Adonijah goes first. And then again we see this idea of Solomon's hand, the kingdom being established. Abiathar is exiled. Abiathar was the priest who went along with Adonijah. And the writer of 1 Kings gives us this little note here that tells us that when Solomon exiles Abiathar, that it is fulfilling the word of the Lord concerning the house of Eli. So let's turn over to 1 Samuel chapter 2. You remember that Eli trained Samuel. Eli had sons who are described as worthless. And he spoke to them, but we're given the impression that God expected Eli to do more when it came to his sons. So God sends a man of God to Eli to prophesy against him. And in verses 30 through 36 of 1 Samuel chapter 2, therefore the Lord, the God of Israel, declares, I promise that your house and the house of your father should go in and out before me forever. But now the Lord declares, far be it from me, for those who honor me I will honor, and those who despise me shall be lightly esteemed. Behold, the days are coming when I will cut off your strength and the strength of your father's house, so that there will not be an old man in your house. Then in distress you will look with envious eye on all the prosperity that shall be bestowed on Israel, and there shall not be an old man in your house forever. The only one of you whom I shall not cut off from my altar shall be spared to weep his eyes out, to grieve his heart, and all the descendants of your house shall die by the sword of men. And this that shall come upon your two sons, Hophni and Phinehas, shall be the sign to you. Both of them shall die on the same day. And I will raise up for myself a faithful priest who shall do according to what is in my heart and in my mind. And I will build him a sure house, and he shall go in and out before my anointed forever. And everyone who is left in your house shall come to implore him for a piece of silver or a loaf of bread, and shall say, please put me in one of the priest's places, that I may eat a morsel. It tells him, is you go and live on your land. And he's essentially now unemployed. Because as part of being a priest and the work that you would do, there would be an allotment for you. That's how you made your living through your work as a priest. And now he's got to go stay on his own land and figure it out for himself. And in 1 Samuel, we get this really bad picture of what Abiathar's life is going to be like in exile. And it all goes back to the prophecy against Eli. And then Joab gets to meet Benaiah. Solomon tells Benaiah to go kill him. Joab runs after Adonijah is killed, and he grabs hold of the horns of the altar. Solomon tells Benaiah, go kill him. Benaiah goes to him and says to come down. And Joab says, nope, I'll die right here. Benaiah goes back and tells Solomon he won't come down. Solomon says, kill him where he stands. And Benaiah executes him as he holds on to the horns of the altar. Shimei is first put on house arrest. Solomon tells him, you know everything that you did to David. Here's what I'm going to do to you. Build a house in Jerusalem and stay there. Don't leave. On the day that you leave, you'll die. We're told that 3 years go by, and then Solomon finds out that Shimei's servants ran away to the Philistines and that he left Jerusalem to go get them, and he brought them back. Solomon calls him in, says, you know what I told you. You said it was good. You said you'd do it, and you haven't. And says, Benaiah, kill him. And so we get to this picture again of Solomon's hand and the kingdom being established in Solomon's hand. Thoughts, questions?
In that story, the last sentence, so the kingdom was established in the hand of Solomon. To me it says, and the remnant, the ones who would bring him down, are gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, any doubts have now been removed. That he's the king, and that do not doubt him and don't take a stand against him. All right. 1 Kings chapter 3. Solomon in 3 verses. 1 Kings chapter 3 is really important. If you had to pick one chapter and you wanted to know Solomon, you would read 1 Kings chapter 3. Super important. We won't get to all of it tonight, but we'll go ahead and get started. I won't be here next week. Josh is going to do the temple next week, but then we'll pick it up the week after that. All right? And we'll pick up right there. 1 Kings chapter 3, 2 weeks from tonight.
My prayer, Jehovah.